I understand people have strong feelings and deep convictions. In America, we respect the right and protect the right for them to express that. But it doesn't mean anything goes. It needs to be done without violence, without destruction, without hate, and within the law.
President Biden addressing the nation on the violent anti-war protests that are exploding on university campuses. The president's remarks coming after clashes played out on UCLA's campus overnight Wednesday, with police forcefully removing pro-Palestinian protesters and tearing down barricades, taking down encampments. Joining me now is the Hill's White House reporter Alex Gangitano. Alex, why has it taken the president so long to speak out on this issue?
Yeah, it's a great question. Critics have been pushing him to come out sooner, most notably former President Trump, who himself has called the protests a disgrace on what we're seeing on college campuses. He slammed Biden on Wednesday for his lack of public comment as these scenes were playing out, on televisions across the country. Also, White House reporters have been asking the White House all week if Biden will talk about the protests and didn't get a clear answer until it was announced earlier this morning. And up until his speech today, we only heard in passing the president condemning the anti-Semitism that has bubbled up as part of some of these protests. But otherwise, we hadn't gotten a clear answer about his stance on it.
Alex, the House passed the Bipartisan Anti-Semitism Awareness Act Wednesday. Its next hurdle, the Senate. Now, is there any indication President Biden will end up signing the bill if and when it lands on his desk?
That's a good question. We haven't gotten a clear answer from the White House on that one. The White House has been really firm about condemning anti-Semitism. They've also deployed Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff to work on the issue from within the White House. And this was even before the October 7th attacks on Israel. So this has been an important point for the White House for, a year now. And this bill is an interesting one. If it's enacted, it would basically require the Department of Education to use the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism when they're enforcing these anti-discrimination laws. So basically make it stricter and make boundaries around how strict they can go with enforcing anti-Semitism laws.
And right now, both parties are speaking out against the rise of anti-Semitism, which the bill really does aim to address. But Democrats seem much more divided on the topic overall than their Republican counterparts. Which party really has the upper hand here, Alex?
Yeah, seeing this divide is interesting because there's also a divide among Democrats over how split they are supporting the protesters or supporting the president's pro-Israel stance. I think in terms of the upper hand politically, polling has indicated that an overwhelming majority of Americans do support Israel in this war. And an interesting thing about that poll, which actually came out this week, was that 80% of registered voters said they'll support Israel over Hamas, but also that the older age groups were the much more likely group to support Israel than the younger respondents. And of course, it is young faces of who we're seeing on television at these campus protests. And older Americans are definitely a demographic that the president needs. That's who votes in elections very often. And so if he, continues on his pro-Israel stance, he's not getting pushback from older Americans. But of course, the public pushback from progressives, young Americans, Arab Americans, Muslim Americans is very real and something that he has to balance.
So there are many divides. Absolutely. Now turning to former President Donald Trump right now, he's holding his first campaign rallies since the criminal trial began. On Wednesday, Trump urged college presidents to take a tougher approach to the protest over the war in Gaza.
The radical extremists and far-left agitators are terrorizing college campuses, as you possibly noticed. I say remove the encampments immediately, vanquish the radicals, and take back our campuses for all of the normal students who want a safe place from which to learn.
Alex, with Trump ramping up his rhetoric and Biden now also weighing in, how will this play out in the presidential race?
Yeah, this is going to be a tough one for the president to navigate. The former president has made clear where his stance is on the issue in terms of condemning these college protests. But basically, President Biden has to figure out how not to alienate young voters, Arab Americans, progressives, Muslim Americans, these big demographics that he needs this voting bloc to show up for him in November. But then we're also seeing, he doesn't want to alienate moderates, of Republicans who are maybe swing voters, older Americans who think that he should take a firmer stance on condemning these protests. What's also been interesting to witness from this president is when he's been faced with protests, which have really been following him around the country since the October 7th attacks. He sometimes engages with protesters. He's been interrupted during campaign rallies or big speeches from protesters. And sometimes he'll agree with them or say things like, more aid does need to go into Gaza, or I care about healthcare issues within for the people of Gaza. But the messaging about these college campus protests, which of course he hasn't physically gone to witness himself, but has been that basically the White House is focusing on the anti-Semitism, bubbling up violence or whatever hate-fueled speech there is, as opposed to, and making it that these actions take it a step too far, as opposed to what we've seen when other protesters have confronted him and he tends to engage with them. So it's an interesting dynamic that he's trying to figure out here.
Another main focus on the campaign trail, abortion access. Arizona voted to repeal a Civil War-era ban 3 weeks after the state Supreme Court revived the law. Trump has repeatedly said any decision on abortion should be left to the states, and Democrats are seizing on Trump's abortion stance. Will it help them bring out voters this November, particularly those undecided voters?
Yeah, so Democrats are definitely banking on this as an issue that they think will help them in November. In 2022, the election happened just months after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, and Democrats experienced better than expected results in that election. So they're still thinking it's a good strategy for them to lean into the fact that many Americans might feel that the abortion laws popping up in red states in particular take it a step too far and are too restrictive. Trump's strategy to stress that he thinks it should be left to the states could end up helping him, especially with some moderate Republicans who wanted Roe v. Wade overturned but make it a states issue, and they don't support it as a national abortion ban. But something interesting that we've seen from actually Vice President Harris twice now over the last few weeks on the campaign trail, she said not to believe Trump when he says that it should be a states issue, and that he's, quote, gaslighting Americans, and that he would sign a national abortion ban if it did reach his desk if he won a second term. So they're using that against him as well. The rhetoric from Democrats have definitely been, you can't trust Republicans here. This is the repercussions of Roe v. Wade being overturned, and that Democrats will codify that if they win the White House and Congress. So it's really their gamble to figure out if it will work again as a strategy for them.
Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene is on a relentless crusade to oust House Speaker Mike Johnson and says next week that she will trigger a motion to do so, even with Democrats promising to step in and save him. Alex, at this point, Republicans aren't exactly thrilled with that effort of hers. So will Democrats really wind up coming to Johnson's aid? And at what cost? Are they going to expect something in return?
Yeah, so it's really an unbelievable, revelation that's gone on that Democrats have said, we want Johnson to stay in power for the sake of the chamber's stability, and we will help him stay in power. That's not something that's typical that you'd back the opposing side's leader. I think Greene's threat to oust Johnson, of course, comes after a series of deals that he's made with President Biden, most recently federal spending and aid to Ukraine, and that, her and hardline Republicans are not happy with the fact that he's willing to work with the president. And so basically what Democrats are doing, which props up the opposition, I think is somewhat transactional in the sense that, one, they want to keep the stability in Congress. They also, I think, are banking on if we help Johnson, then maybe he'd be more likely to strike deals with us in the future, like he did on government funding, on aid to Ukraine, and actually work with the president instead of shutting down what Democrats want to do. And I think it also is something that the Democrats are hoping will help them on the campaign trail, because they can say, we're the party that stopped the chaos. We're trying to get things moving in Washington while Republicans are in this mess and can't figure out their leader. So we had to step in and help. So I think that's a message that they're going to take to the trail, and we'll see if it actually plays out well with voters.
And finally, President Biden is heading to North Carolina Thursday, announcing a $3 billion infrastructure deal. What is on his agenda, and how focused is the Biden re-election campaign on the Tar Heel state?
Yeah, North Carolina is the main state that they're looking to flip after the president narrowly lost it in 2020 to Trump. They've also added Florida to that list of a state they want to flip, but North Carolina at this point seems the most likely for Biden to be able to turn blue. So yeah, this $3 billion in funds to replace lead pipes, which basically can pose a health hazard, and so it's something that the president's been focused on, is part of the billions of dollars included in the bipartisan infrastructure law. That's a law that the president uses on the campaign trail a lot to prove, that he is giving these long-term wins to communities and to states, regardless of the states are red, blue, Biden supporters, Trump supporters, and that he wants to help communities in a way that's tangible efforts that maybe Republicans, or his argument, Republicans aren't doing. We're also going to see him in North Carolina meet with the families of the police officers who were killed in Charlotte earlier this week in the line of duty. That's also part of his, messaging that he supports law enforcement and wants to combat crime. So his visits in North Carolina are definitely very notable as all part of his overall campaign strategy and his focus on the state in order to try to flip it.
Thank you, Alex. A lot to tackle here today. Thanks.
Thank you.
Former President Trump is back in a Manhattan courtroom Thursday for another day of testimony in his hush money trial and a hearing on what the prosecution says are 4 new gag order violations. The judge in the case did not offer an immediate decision on the alleged gag order violations. Those alleged violations are in addition to the 9 violations for which Trump was fined last week. Meantime, testimony from the lawyer who negotiated Stormy Daniels' hush money deal has resumed. The defense is set to begin cross-examination Thursday afternoon. Despite Trump's ongoing criminal trial in New York, the former president still holds a slight lead over President Biden across 7 critical swing states, including Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. That's according to a new Emerson College polling, The Hill poll. We're bringing in Emerson College polling Senior Director Matt Taglia to break down these numbers for us. Matt, thanks so much for being here.
Of course, happy to be here.
We're going to jump right in. Trump leads in all 7 major swing states, but there's a major chunk of voters who are still undecided. 11% in Michigan and Nevada, 10% in North Carolina. Which direction are these independents actually leaning?
Well, it's a little hard to say. They aren't all leaning the same direction, but we do see that more younger voters are undecided, and that's under 40. And we see that these leaners that we call, so folks who we ask if they had to decide today, who would they choose? It's about 52% for Trump and 48% for Biden. So that, again, isn't spread equally across these states. Undecideds in Georgia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania break for Biden, whereas in the other states, they break for Trump. So overall, more independents are undecided, as we might expect, and they are currently breaking for Trump as a whole. So these are relatively small sample sizes per state, but I think the overall picture is that Trump is winning these narrowly. We could say that they're sort of split, but all that said, it's not terrible news for the Biden campaign. He seems to be up in most of these states since February polling. But I think they will want to see those undecided numbers breaking more decisively for them.
Now, in that 3-way race poll, RFK Jr. is polling nearly 10% of voters in some states, 9% in Arizona, and 8% in Nevada. Where is that support coming from, and do you expect it will grow between now and November?
So again, the story here is a little bit about younger voters. So these are voters who are broadly under the age of 50, but especially those who are under the age of 40. And we can see between 8 and 11% of those who are under 50 are backing Kennedy when we expand that ballot test. Whereas for folks who are over the age of 50, Kennedy only earns about 4%. So those are pretty substantially different margins. Overall, Kennedy is pulling about 4% from initial Biden voters, whereas he's pulling about 5% from initial Trump voters. So that's a little bit of a wash. But I think looking at this and trying to plan ahead, I don't think that his support grows from here. In fact, I think if anything, we're going to see his support shrink a little bit, as a lot of third-party candidates have in the past few election cycles, and especially as we start looking at ballot access. But even assuming he gets access in these swing states, I think that younger vote is eventually going to catch up to the older vote, as some of these perhaps less informed voters, folks who aren't necessarily paying attention yet, start to pay attention and realize, hey, maybe there isn't a path to the White House here.
Matt, we mentioned the former president's criminal trial in New York earlier. Those numbers suggest most voters believe the trial is appropriate to hold Trump accountable. Will that impact the way they vote?
It's true that most voters do believe that the trial is appropriate to hold Trump accountable, but that's not necessarily going to impact the majority of voters' vote. Now, if Trump is found guilty, that could have an impact. At first, looking at that, it's a bit of a wash. About a third of voters say that it makes them less likely to vote for the former president, whereas another third say it makes them more likely. But if we look at the undecided numbers specifically, 41% say that it makes them less likely to support Donald Trump if he is found guilty in that trial. And normally that might not make a huge difference, but in these swing states where it's going to be very tight, that could make a substantial difference, especially when we see such a high undecided number right now.
And President Biden may be trailing Trump at the moment, but we're seeing some members of his party polling ahead of their Republican counterparts. Ruben Gallego leads Kari Lake in the Arizona Senate race, and Bob Casey is leading Dave McCormick in Pennsylvania. Now, why are voters in these key states supporting Democrats but not Biden?
And that's a tough question to answer, but we do see that in every case, independent voters are breaking for Democrats at a higher rate than they are breaking for President Biden. In all of these states, and including North Carolina, where there's a gubernatorial race, independent voters are breaking a little bit more with the Democratic candidates. We're also seeing a little bit less defection from these younger voters who would normally expect to be Democratic voters, but sometimes aren't necessarily supporting President Biden at the top of the ticket. Otherwise, there's little in the numbers to go by as far as exactly why these candidates are doing better than President Biden. But I think it's just worth noting that these Republican candidates aren't Donald Trump, and sometimes that crossover appeal, that appeal that Trump manages to elicit from independent voters and voters who aren't traditionally with the Republican Party, that doesn't necessarily translate further down the ballot.
Matt Taglia, Senior Director for Emerson College Polling, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Margaret Chadbourn. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.